Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals.
bestsellers,
Future bestsellers.
sleep stories.
Sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Hello, thank you for joining us. This is Memoir, Rebuilding Life After Loss. It's a virtual event with the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, and I'm Dinah Lenney. I'm a writer, an editor, a teacher. It's my great delight today to be here with Emily Rapp Black and Sara Seager and Suleika Jaouad. And I want to introduce you to them. I'm going to tell you a bit about them. Emily Rapp Black is a Guggenheim Fellow and an Associate Professor of Creative Writing at UC Riverside. She's an acclaimed and prize-winning author of 3 memoirs, Poster Child, The Still Point of the Turning World, and Sanctuary, which is the book we're talking about today. She has a collection of essays forthcoming this summer titled Frida Kahlo and My Left Leg. Sara Seager is a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant winner. She's an astrophysicist and professor of physics and planetary science at MIT, and her memoir, The Smallest Lights in the Universe, is an LA Times Book Prize finalist this year. And Suleika Jaouad is an Emmy Award-winning writer and the youngest columnist ever to be featured in the New York Times. And she's the founder and creator of the Isolation Journals, which has, in this last year, provided inspiration and community to some 100,000 writers from all over the world. Her book, a memoir, which published to starred reviews every which way a few short months ago, is titled Between Two Kingdoms, a memoir of a life interrupted. And let me just say that these books are available far and wide, and especially at your local independent bookstores. And if you go to Pages, a bookstore, you can get signed book plates. They're available from the authors. So welcome, Emily, Sara, and Suleika. I want to talk about your beautiful books, each of which celebrates the power of love and family and friendship and work and imagination, even as they fully and frankly reckon with tragedy and trauma and tremendous loss. In Sanctuary, Emily examines the language we use around grief and loss in her determination to honor the life of her dead son, even as she goes about raising a very much alive little girl. And Sara, a widow at 40, has 2 young sons to mother. Even as she mourns the death of her husband, she's actively and literally searching the stars for evidence of life beyond this planet. Suleika, diagnosed with life-threatening cancer when she is just barely out of college, is consequently up against death from all sides. She makes friends only to lose them, and all the while she's fighting for her life and adjusting her expectations, and then having to figure out pretty much from scratch how to be, how to live, how to proceed. So before we do anything else, I'm sort of hoping that each of you will read us a paragraph or two, and that way, when we go back to the books, when we read them, we'll have your voices in our heads. Emily, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Dinah. I'm so glad to be here and glad to be with all of you, the panelists and audience. So I'm just going to read a short paragraph from Sanctuary that's about memory and how we talk about our lives after a particular loss and how memory plays into that. So this is in reference to when people ask me how many children I have, and I have to make a decision about whether or not to say 2 and then answer more questions, or just 1, and how that functions in my lived experience. Memory, with its strange and extraordinary power to make and unmake the world, is perhaps itself an accident of evolution. What is forgotten inside what is remembered? How do we pluck the most significant moments out of the rank and file of ordinary memories? These 2 children, one so different from the other. Does this make me 2 different mothers, 2 different women leading 2 wildly different lives? Must I separate them? Should I just forget the other woman, a different child, forget about her living a totally different life ever existed? I don't think so. Perhaps we can live our best lives only in the moments when past and present converge and recombine, like in the coiled DNA helix. Maybe we live well only when we understand that our lives are always spinning inside chaos, with possibilities both wondrous and catastrophic moving side by side within even the tiniest revolution. Maybe we have to live all of our lives in all of their pain and joy, all at once and at the same time. What is required for us to do that?
Thank you. Sara, will you read to us?
Yes, I decided to read you the last couple of paragraphs of my book. It may seem like an odd thing to do, but despite the story of grief, it's a story of hope. And my book interweaves my personal journey, but also my professional journey. So I call it the exploration of outer space and the exploration of inner space. So in my job, as Dinah mentioned, it's the search for planets around other stars and the search for possible signs of life on those planets. So, is there other life in the universe? That's the question I always thought I needed to answer. Maybe I've been wrong all this time. Maybe trying to see the smallest lights in the universe isn't about who exactly we'll encounter there. Maybe it doesn't matter what aliens really look like, what form their version of life takes. Maybe our search shouldn't be about them. Maybe it never was. Do I believe in other life in the universe? Yes, I believe. The better question, what does our search for it say about us? It says we're curious. It says we're hopeful. It says we're capable of wonder and wonderful things. I don't think it's an accident that there's a mirror at the heart of every large telescope. If we want to find another Earth, that means we want to find another us. We think we're worth knowing. We want to be a light in somebody else's sky. And so long as we keep looking for each other, we will never be alone.
Thank you. Suleika, will you read to us?
Of course. Hi, everyone. Hi, Dinah. Hi, Emily. Hi, Sara. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. So I'm going to read a passage from the middle of my book that explores the aftermath of a reckoning, which in my particular case was leukemia. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick, Susan Sontag wrote in Illness's Metaphor. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. By the time I reached my last day of chemo, I'd spent the majority of my adult life in that other realm, the kingdom of the sick no one cares to inhabit. Initially, I'd clung to the hope of a short sojourn, one in which I wouldn't have to unpack my bags. I'd resisted the label of cancer patient, believing I could remain the person I'd been. But as I grew sicker, I'd watched my old self vanish. In place of my name, I had been issued a patient ID number. I'd learned to speak fluent medicalese. Even my molecular identity had morphed. When my brother's stem cells engrafted in my marrow, my DNA had irreversibly mutated. With my bald head, pallor, and port, illness became the first thing that people noticed about me. As months bled into years, I'd adapted to the mores of this new land as best I could, befriended its inhabitants, even carved out a career within its confines. In its terrain, I'd built a home, accepting not only that I might stay there for a while, but that likely I would never leave. It was the outside world, the kingdom of the well, that had grown alien and frightening.
Thank you. Such beautiful books and beautiful readings. And you've all been so generous with your readers, I think, to go back to this time, for each of you to revisit the tragedy and loss and trauma that you experienced. It's a really generous move, I think. And I wondered if you'd talk about it a little bit. What's in it for the memoirist? Why did each of you choose to revisit the past in this way? And what did it bring you? Who wants to start?
I'll start.
Good.
I'll start. That's a great question, Dinah. I think for me, the reason that I have ever written anything, and certainly a book, is because when I was going through something difficult, I couldn't find a book that would be helpful to me. And as someone who's always found solace in books, that's what I looked for. And so I wrote in each case the book I wish I'd had to read when I was going through that particular thing. So when my son was dying, of course, I felt very much slapped with the sort of tragic label, which I'd experienced already as a person with a disability, but that was a whole different experience. And I think for me, I really envision writing as an act of service. And I think that writers, or I as a writer, do it because I want people to feel less alone when they read my books, if they've experienced something similar, or even if they haven't. So that for me is what's in it for the memoirist.
And when you're writing, when writing is an act of service, I think, Suleika, certainly you feel that way as well. Even having founded the isolation journals, which is a way for other people to write through their sense of isolation during the pandemic. Talk about what you got out of this, and talk about writing in real time. I'm interested in what you say, Emily, just because I wonder how much revision is involved when you're sort of writing through this stuff and processing. Then, but everybody chime in, Sara and Suleika. What Sara, for you, is the writing an act of service? Was the writing for you, or was it for us?
Both, actually. In my case, it was both. So only part of my book is about death and grief. But when I was widowed, I miraculously bumped into another widow in my town my town is now 19,000 people. And she told me there was already a group of them, like 6 or 7 of them, all with kids about the same age. All the widows were about the same age. And I just thought, wow, how is this possible? Yeah. And after meeting them, of course, we had a lot of grief, but there was a lot of joy and dark humor and craziness that went along with this really kind of unique space. And I immediately asked them, wow, is someone writing, or one of you writing a book about this? People should know about this. Almost like a cult-like secret thing. And none of them did. They had their reasons for not writing. And so I had always wanted to write it. And I'm happy now because it's many years later. Like my book, a lot of it happened 10 years ago. But at the time when I wrote it, it was very cathartic. Like pouring yourself out onto the page. It really, really, it helped. It was hard, but it's helpful to like relive it over and over again to process.
Suleika, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that way too? Was it, because I know that you journal so that you're processing in real time, but what was it like to actually go back and relive this stuff for an audience?
I just want to echo what Sara and Emily are saying. I think for me, I always write either the things that I want to read and that don't exist, or I write a kind of alternate narrative to the one that's being presented. So in this case, with my book, when you're in survival mode, there's one goal, which is to get through the experience. And the final act of a lot of illness memoirs is the cure. But for me, the kind of hard work of healing didn't end with a cure. That's actually where it began. And I was really interested in what happens after. I think the months and years after, when we're kind of forced to carry that wreckage and to make sense of it and to figure out how to move forward with it, are the kind of quieter, less dramatic moments in a story like this. And therefore, I think the ones that are most kind of enshrouded in a kind of omerta of silence. So I don't know that writing is necessarily cathartic for me. It can be. This book was not that. I had a Post-it note above my desk that said, if you want to write a good book, write what you don't want others to know about you. If you want to write a great book, write what you don't want to know about myself. And I was really interested in kind of traveling to where the silences were, and the illness experience and the experience of reentry, and kind of excavating that maybe uglier, less palatable underbelly of how illness can bring us as patients and caregivers down to our most savage selves.
Yes, I love that about all 3 of these books, actually. All of them reckon with the darker side, and all of them do it with humor, I mean, you certainly have all lightened this experience for us in ways, although that's really the wrong way to put it, because I think that what the humor does is it intensifies the experience of the grief and the sorrow. That's how humor works. But I wondered if you could talk some more about that, because there's tremendous rage in all three of these books. All of you get angry, and all of you point a finger at yourselves for getting angry, and all of you laugh at yourselves. But talk a little bit about that. How conscious was that effort? Emily, did you find yourself, because you write about being furious, did you find yourself wanting to mitigate that at all when you went back to revise, or did you say, no, I need to get more of this in there?
No, I didn't really feel like mitigating it, and I think that's one of the things that it's especially women memoirists or women writers are often asked to do, is to sort of to sugarcoat the experience, if you will. And I didn't want to do that because it wasn't the truth. It doesn't mean there wasn't profound and beautiful sacred moments in my son's life, but his death was certainly not easy, and that made me full of rage, and the whole diagnosis made me full of rage. But also, I think first of all, I think I'm really funny. And I think that I'm funny because I've had a lot of things that have happened to me that aren't funny. And it's like I run a writing through child loss group, and all of the women have lost children. And I mean, we laugh at things that aren't funny. It's the best feeling in the world. It's this sort of, and it's the same in the disabled community that I'm a part of. You know, we have a sort of a shorthand of humor. And so, yeah, I wanted there to be humor in the book, and I also wanted there to be rage. I do think, Dinah, to your point, they're very much related, and that each intensifies the other, just like the depth of someone's grief for a person who's lost is a sort of measure of the depth and, boundlessness of their love. So, that you can't have one or the other.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you all are writing about community, about, Suleika, in the second half of your book, you're going to go off and see the people that have written to you while you've been sick. And Sara, you talk about this widows group and the dark sort of humor and the way you were solace to each other. I wonder how many of those people you've heard from since writing these books. How many of these people are in your lives still? Anybody?
Yeah, I'd like to just say something funny. So in my book, the woman I met who introduced me who was also a widow and introduced me to the widows, her name's Melissa, and she remains my best friend to this day. And what's so funny and sweet is everybody knows her. So if you read the book, you actually know Melissa. And she really likes that. The other widows in the group, I still consider them my friends, and most of them are still in town. Some of the kids are in college now, but we're not really a group anymore. We've all kind of gone back to a new normal, and we're not tight like we used to be.
That's interesting. The friendship is so important in these books, and all of these books are about romance. All of them are about sort of great romantic love, but in each case, you're coming back to who your friends are, all of you.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo what Emily and Sara are saying. I think, when a tragedy occurs, the response is often, I have no words. And I haven't met a single person who's endured some great loss or, deadly illness that hasn't been surprised both by the friends they expected to show up and who didn't, and those who kind of emerged out of the woodwork. And I think sometimes when people don't know what to say, they say nothing at all and they stay away because of it. But what I found to be most unexpected was the way in which, for me, the state of being sick meant that I was vulnerable. There was no way for me to mask my vulnerability. But the beauty of vulnerability is that it reverberates. And it's a kind of magnet, and people respond in kind with their own vulnerabilities and their own stories. And during those years that I was sick, I heard from so many people, people like me who were undergoing treatment. I had a whole group of friends who were all in their 20s and were also undergoing cancer treatment who became my kind of buddy system. I heard from, a woman in California who had lost her son to suicide. I heard from an inmate on death row who was experiencing his own kind of isolation and in solitary confinement in me in my hospital room bubble. And there was this beautiful kind of opening of my world at a time when it had dwindled to a small hospital room. So there was kind of constant push and pull of, on the one hand, feeling quite isolated, and on the other hand, feeling like I have been kind of forced to reimagine community and was able to meet all kinds of people I otherwise wouldn't have.
And then these books come out in the middle of a time of isolation, which is interesting. I wonder, the writing itself is isolating. It requires a kind of isolation. But then when you're coming back to the world and publishing a book, and suddenly you're thrown into a pandemic. Emily, talk about bringing this book out in the pandemic. What was that like for you?
I mean, it was bizarre. The whole year has been bizarre. 2020 was bizarre, for lack of a better word, or lack of a curse word, rather. But I think for me, it was, in some ways, it was easier because one of the things that I've always found really difficult is, or have always experienced, is that people ask me really embarrassing questions almost all the time. What happened to you? What's wrong with you? Why do you walk that way? What's wrong with your son? I would die if I were you. How do you do it? And that's one thing to sort of mitigate on Zoom, but it's another thing if someone's coming up to you and kind of hugging you and saying those things. It's a lot of emotional labor. And I feel like I did the emotional labor in the book, and it was a lot of labor. So I feel like I've done my job to the best of my ability. And I also think, I think this is related to what you're saying. For me, I write memoir to maintain a sense of privacy in my vulnerability. And I completely echo that idea of vulnerability being sort of, for me, an unwelcome state, and one that I had resisted all of my life, essentially, but kept kind of having situations where I was vulnerable at a very young age. And I feel like when I write these books and people are like, oh, well, they want more of the story. And I just say, well, all the story that I'm willing to tell is there. And that's the rest of my life I have to keep private.
I see you guys nodding your heads. Do you feel that, Sara, does that ring true for you? Do you feel like you were in some ways, as writing a piece of memoir, that you're controlling the narrative, that this is as much as you want to or need to tell?
Well, unlike Emily, this is my only book. I might write another book, but I might not. My job is a scientist, and I kind of only had my one story. And it wasn't as in control as I wanted. Like, it's that really tension between how much do you need to reveal for the story to be meaningful, and how much is just way too personal. And I certainly struggled with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I struggled with that. And I did have editors, there was an editor and like a junior editor who were very involved and pushed for more. So yeah, I'm happy with how it turned out, but it's certainly, like, you might see on the outside, wow, why would you write all this personal stuff about yourself? And it is, that's how it feels too.
Was there something that was particularly difficult for you to put to the page?
Like, it's hard to kind of go back and unpack it all, but I really wanted to, like, I would have liked to maybe have less detail about, like, I wanted to do grief and hope. And the point was the book wouldn't have made sense unless I started from the beginning.
Right.
So I saw a good place to start would have been even just meeting the widows, and then maybe filling in a bit of the backstory. But it didn't make any sense to write it that way. So I had to kind of go through the whole story, and it's a lot of detail.
That's interesting. Talk about Suleika and Emily. Talk about working with editors and where you were asked for more and maybe pushed back, or where you uh, put in something that an editor wasn't thrilled about. What's your experience of that relationship? Suleika,
I mean,
you're
I think
nodding. Go ahead.
for me, the greatest act of curation comes in when I'm writing about other people. It's one thing for me to unveil certain parts of myself, but I think as memoirists, we have, a responsibility to the people who appear in our book's pages. And so, my friend and mentor, Melissa Phoebus, was someone I was sending chapters to every couple of weeks when I was really struggling to figure out how to get through a certain section of the book. And I wrote about a 50-page chapter that I sent her. And I said, I'm really worried this is going to be hurtful to someone I care about. And she said, well, you have to have a conversation with them. But for the time being, keep writing. And I did. And when I got to the end of the manuscript and the first draft of the book was due, I called her up and she said, did you have that difficult conversation? And I said, no, and I don't think I can. And she said, great, cut it. And I did. And I sent it to my agent and to my editor, and they never noticed. And I think for me, there were a couple of important lessons embedded in that experience. The first is that, of course, there's the book that you write for yourself, and then the one that you share with the world. But that sometimes, you have to write something in order to move through to whatever comes next. But I mean, the beauty of being the narrator is that you also have narrative control, and you can make decisions like that. And I was very fortunate to have an amazing editor, Andy Ward, who was there every step of the way. He's old school. He would mark up my pages with pen and paper by hand, and was really kind of willing to let me put things in and take things out, and respected that it can be writing a memoir can be a complicated position to put yourself in that requires a lot of care and caution.
Emily, I want you to sort of weigh in on this in terms of leaving things out, editors and editor feedback, and jump in. And then I want to ask you, I have a question that I want to ask off of what you just said, Suleika. So.
Yeah,
Emily.
I mean, I have my editor, Andrea Walker, is basically one of my favorite people in the world. And she is the only editor that I also worked with Andy on another book, and he's an amazing editor as well. And also Andrea's old school. I would get the marked up pages and she'd be like, boring, like in the sections, or what, awkward. So she really is, all writing is an act of collaboration, at least in my experience. And these books, any of the books that I've written, the last two books, I would not have existed without her. And there's no way to really, it's one of the most satisfying intellectually and emotionally, one of the most satisfying relationships, professional relationships that I've ever had. And it's just kind of a transformative thing to have someone believe in you so strongly, but also tell you when you are being boring or when something isn't required. Yeah.
Right. And I'm interested too, because Suleika, when you were saying that the act of writing is complicated for a memoirist, there's the implication is, I hope I'm not projecting, from my own experience, but books change, in our fingers. The act of writing leads to discovery, and there are things that you find out via the writing that you wouldn't have discovered. And I wondered if each of you if there's a situation, if there's something in the book on the level of insight into your experience that you didn't know when you started, that the writing led you to. Does that make sense? the whole, you know what I'm thinking of, Emily, very specifically, I'm thinking of the whole butterfly exhibit and how did that, there's this wonderful chapter in Emily's book where she takes Charlie, her daughter, to see, you know, one of those butterfly exhibits, and she asks if the docent, well, Emily, you tell about this docent and this butterfly.
Well, I mean, you know, it was one of those moments where I was like, this is out of a movie. I mean, it's like one of those like pressurized butterfly domes, and the butterflies are massive. Like they're not just like your average butterfly. They're massive and they fly and they swoop like birds. And my daughter was just so captivated, as she was 2 at the time, I think, or almost 3. And, you know, they would land on her hand, you know, and she would look at it. And I was just thinking, like, they're beating their wings so strongly. They have so much strength. But if she wanted to, she could just crush it with her hand. And I've been thinking about resilience a lot based on a conversation I'd had with my editor right after Charlie was born, and about resilience. And I thought, wow, it's like, this to me is a very potent image of not like resilience, not being a muscle or something that you that's about strength or powering through, but it's about this combination or this balance of vulnerability and determination and strength. And that's sort of, to me, that was the image. And when that was happening, I was like, oh, I have to write about this, because it was also, you know, these flowers were blooming and it was sensory overload. And I asked the docent leaving, I was like, what happens if they rip their wings? And he's like, well, they just keep flying. They just figure out how to do it until they can't anymore. And I was like, so that happened pretty quickly and organically after that moment.
Right. And then you write your way into it, and it becomes this kind of lyrical sort of, you know, tribute to the human condition, you know. Sara, I'm thinking of the end of your book with the mirror and the telescope, and what a wonderful image that is. And did that come to you because you were writing about it, or have you always known that?
No, I think my self-discovery was I was one of the people who never had friends as a child. I was always really all alone. And before I wrote the book, I learned I'm autistic. A lot of people learn that at an older age. I try really hard to not show it. But after writing the book, I realized I had so many friends, not just the widow community, but my scientific family. At the time, some of my students and other researchers on my team, we'd go to conferences and then on vacation together after the conferences. And I hadn't really ever switched from that lonely little girl who was rejected pretty much by everybody to, wow, a grown up with so many friends. And I came to that realization, as you've pointed out over and over, common to each of our books, is this sense of community when the people stand by you in times of need.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Suleika, how about you? What did you find out in the course? I mean, you've been writing for such a long time, and I'm sure this happens to you over and over again, but in the course of writing this book, were there discoveries?
I mean, so many. If I'm not discovering new things, then I feel like I'm not doing my job right. I mean, I come from a journalism background, and so I approached my memoir with that mindset. And, you know, my journals were my primary source material. I requested all of my medical records. I interviewed my parents. My mom even, you know, gave me her journals from the time that I was sick so that I could really understand what it was like to sit in that caregiver's chair. And there were so many discoveries. I mean, one example comes to mind. There was a friend who I thought never called or visited after my diagnosis. And as I was combing through old emails, I found an email from him. And I realized, you know, that during that time, those many months when I was in the hospital and on a mother load of morphine, I must have received that email, read it, and completely forgotten about it. And so that was like a really kind of astounding and humbling experience, and just shows how, you know, unreliable our memory is. And, you know, there's a way in which trauma changes our mentation. So that was something I really found endlessly fascinating to research. But the other thing I did was I hired an amazing fact checker, Ben Phelan, who went through the entire book. And I learned so much from that experience. And I think he and the conversations he had with everyone who appeared in my book all the details that emerged from that, the lines of dialogue made the book so much better. And it was always interesting to, there were some people who felt certain facts weren't quite right. There were other people who were upset that they weren't more in the book. And it was just kind of like endlessly surprising to learn how different people react to a memoir.
It's funny about memoir that the people that you think will be upset are not the ones who get upset, and the people who you think will be fine are the ones who do get upset. But the idea that somebody's upset with you because they're not enough in the book is sort of a new one to me. All of you have written so beautifully about your families. I think Emily, the chapter about your father in your book is, I sat here and cried. I cried in all of these books made me cry. I'm an easy touch, but truly. And Sara, your relationship with your father, I think, is really important in your book. And we know, Suleika, that your parents and your brother were standing by, and that, I mean, it's interesting that each of you is reckoning with death in a different way. And Suleika, it's your parents who are reckoning with your condition in the way that Emily and Sara are dealing with the world. So to see that is interesting. I wondered how your families feel about these books now. I wonder if you've if they read your work and what they think.
Oh, I can answer that.
Oh, good.
So my parents buy every book that of someone I know or sort of know or have known or told them about has ever written. And they are very proud of me. That I am not from a family, like my parents are working class people, that nobody in the family is a writer, there's a few lawyers, but otherwise it's, you don't know so much have a profession as you have a job. And so they are incredibly proud of me. And actually my mom has read, like, I think all of my books, which is a little bit alarming, with her Lutheran Ladies Book Club. So that could be interesting. And I'm never going to go to their book club, but they definitely, it's like they come from a very conservative sort of Scandinavian, Midwestern background, and they've completely embraced this child that has been problematic like since day one. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I always said that the saddest moment of my life would be the death of my parents. And I'm not sure that's true now, because I think the saddest moment of my life so far was the death of my son. But it'll be really, really hard, because they have showed up for me a time and again, no matter what.
That's wonderful. Sara, your father dies in the book, but he gives you a tremendous gift before he does. Do you want to tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so my dad, he never had the soulmate, the person that he adored, who adored him back. And he always saw me as that person. And it was so sweet, because I hadn't realized how much I meant to him until he was dying, actually. And I visited him every few weeks. I lived in a different country, city. And he thought I might be leaving for the last time, because he didn't know how much time he had left. It wasn't much. It was like a few months from diagnosis to death. So he saw me leaving. He came down the stairs and he said, "Sara, I just want you to know you were the apple of my eye, the joy of my existence, and you've exceeded all expectations." And that was a wow. Like, I just wasn't seeing that coming. And that was his goodbye to me. Yeah.
And
And there's one.
Go ahead, Sara.
No, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, it's a beautiful moment, I think, in the book. I loved it. And it felt very resonant to me. It felt like, okay, well, this gives a person some strength. This allows a person to carry on. Suleika, talk about your parents and their response. First of all, you became very famous, sort of over the course of the column, and now you've written the book, and you've gotten these rave reviews, and there's the isolation journals, and so you've become a bit of a public person. How is this for them? And they must be very proud, of course, but tell us.
Well, I'm trying to compose myself, because both Emily and Sara have managed to make me cry. You know, my parents, um, I always say, yeah, they were truly, at least in my world, like the world's best caregivers, and just were willing to do everything in their power to be there for me when I was sick. But, you know, I was 22. So sometimes doing everything for me wasn't what I wanted. And I think that was incredibly difficult for them. 22 is this strange kind of liminal age where you're not a kid, but you're not fully an adult. Maybe you're more of an aspirational adult at that point. And as far as the book, you know, English is my first language. My dad is a comparative literature professor, and our kind of shared love language was always books and languages and reading. And so I showed them both drafts of my book once I had finished the draft, and I was really nervous about it. I very much wanted them to like it, and then they did. They're incredibly proud. But I think it was hard to revisit those experiences. It was painful for them to read about the ways in which I felt like a burden. Not because they made me feel like a burden, but I think it's impossible to be a sick child and not to feel that on some level. My dad, you know, wrote me this very professorial letter where he called my sex scenes pedestrian, which is funny to me now. But he knew that was the one adjective that would really get under my skin. And I kind of wrote him back and said, so let me get this straight. Do you want me to add more detail, or like, what are we talking about here? So, you know, that's always, I think, complicated as a parent, you know, reading about certain experiences in their kids' memoir. But as far as the public private divide, I mean, anything I write, I always show drafts to the people who appear in them. Because it's one thing to choose to put your life out in public, but I don't believe that that's a choice we can make on other people's behalf. And, you know, that's not a perspective I think that everyone shares, and for good reason, because then you find yourself with like a litany of suggestions that you may or may not want to incorporate. But that has, especially with my family, felt like the only way I can put work out into a public sphere and feel like I can sleep at night.
It's true that we are responsible to other people when we write these kinds of books. I have some questions from our audience, you guys. I have a question, and this is right on topic for all of you. This is a question from Randy, and Randy says, how do you write about people and let go of the fear that they may be angry with the way they've been portrayed? Anybody want to jump in?
I can jump in on that one. I think, well, I think that if someone's angry about what you wrote about them, probably the reason that you wrote that scene was worse than their like after anger, if you will. So I think too, it's like if you're going to write about something that might upset someone, or maybe they behaved in a way that was brutalizing or damaging, I think that as writers, or I believe this, that we have a right to speak from our experience about how that felt without villainizing the person or asking for forgiveness for our own actions that we may regret. So I think for me, I actually don't worry about that anymore. And I think it's because when I was writing my second book, I didn't think I was going to be alive very long. And I just thought, like, I just don't care. And not that I don't care now, but it just was like I couldn't think about it. All I could do was try to get the story on paper and not die, and not want to die, rather. And so that for me sort of has mitigated that concern. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just something that you have to, like what Suleika was saying about, you can't be concerned about that in the drafting stage. You have to write it all down, use everybody's real names, and then, you know, go back and revisit. And I definitely do that. But I don't worry so much about the after rage, because I think the actual rage or the actual brutality of the experience was as bad as it was going to get.
I think that's very smart. I also think that in the drafting stage, it seems to me that you have to write everything down so that you can get to the place that you need to get to. And then if you go back and revision and decide, okay, well, maybe you don't need the part about, A, B, or C to get to D, that can be very helpful for a writer to know. That they might need to write through the experience to get to the gold, whatever it is. I have another question. Does somebody else want to weigh in on that about writing about people?
I just want to briefly weigh in that people were very angry. A few people wrote to me and were absolutely furious, even if they were just two sentences in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you have to write in terms of your feelings. You can't write something that sounds like a truth, because they could sue, I suppose. So I was just surprised. I wasn't expecting that. I thought people might be upset, but that level of anger was just not expected.
And they felt that they could vent that level of anger. There's a story in your book about a colleague who is very, very ungenerous, I think. And I was very happy that you told that story straight.
The thing is that, right, and that particular person, I like him. Like, if I saw him, we'd talk. We might, if we were at a conference, in a group dinner. Like, I don't have any bad feelings towards him, but I didn't know how to kind of convey all of that. And I definitely felt badly about putting that in the book, but it was part of the story, and it had to be there. So I don't have a good answer to that question at all.
Right. I think the answer is that you told the truth as you understand it, and you have to feel okay about that, right? I mean, and the other thing is that
particular person hasn't contacted me, but the other people, they have a different truth. That's the problem. So you write your truth, and they have a different truth, and that's where the conflict comes.
Right. Well, I think it was Tobias Wolff who said that memoir is not writing by committee. So there you go.
Can I just add one small thing to that? I think I was just reminded of something Cheryl Strayed talks about, which is that we have to write from our scars, not our wounds. And I think for me, when it comes to writing about other people, that feels true. I write about a relationship in my book that I'm no longer in. And I really felt like, it was one thing to journal my hurt or whatever about that experience, but I couldn't really write about it in book form until I had kind of processed some of those feelings and was able to write that story and write about that relationship from a place of love. And the other thing I think too is that I always save the sharpest knives for myself. I'm not interested in writing takedown of anyone of revealing anything about anyone else just for the sake of revealing it. And just to be extra careful, I had a few of my closest friends do a pettiness read where they read the entire book, just looking for maybe moments that I wasn't even conscious of that seemed petty or that felt, unnecessarily potentially hurtful or upsetting to someone else.
That's great. I think we should all have pettiness editors. That's a wonderful idea. Thank you for that. Okay, I have a question here from Maggie. She says, would you please, this is a great question, would you please offer a list of resources for healthy grieving, healthy bereavement, after, and I have got, so here it is, healthy bereavement as well, and well-being after loss that are go-to resources for each of you. So that's a great question. What did you read or listen to or hear that was helpful, good, of solace?
Well, I can say that, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, even though you wrote the books you needed at the time, I'm just, who else were you reading?
So I joined a group called Modern Loss, which is a community online and in real life back when we could do those things, or before when we could do those things, that I found incredibly supportive. And there's a book with essays in it from various kinds of people experiencing loss. I think, for me, poetry is always something that I've read because I can't do it and I love it. And it creates a kind of mystery for me and wonder that's an antidote to sadness. I think, I think finding readers, or not readers, writers who speak to you in any way at all is helpful. It doesn't have to be, if People Magazine gives you comfort, read People Magazine. I think you just have to find narratives that support your emotional well-being. I love the writer and thinker Frank Osistowski, who writes a lot about death and end of life. And I took a death camp weekend with him where we talked about death and life and the way that they're inextricably linked. And I find his book, 5 Invitations, a phenomenal resource and just comforting in every level. And if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, even just the sound of his voice, I think is comforting. And I don't mean that in a creepy way. I just think he has so much wisdom and insight about, as someone who watches people die for a living in hospice care, in hospice and palliative care, he just has his finger on something that's so true that it's beautiful, even in its brutality.
Suleika, I know you have a list of writers that have been of solace to you.
The poet Marie Howe has been someone I turn to. She wrote beautifully about her brother Johnny, who died of AIDS. Lucy Greeley is another one. Her memoir, Autobiography of the Face, was one of the few that I could find that dealt with the aftermath of cancer and the way in which those kind of the imprints of a traumatic experience can haunt you long after that kind of inciting event is quote unquote over. From a kind of more self-help perspective, my friend Nora McInerney is just an amazing person and has built an incredible community. She has her podcast, Terrible, Thanks for Asking, and the Hot Young Widows Club. And she also has an incredible TED Talk about how we don't move on from grief. We must learn to move forward with it. And there was one book I read called Unattended Sorrow. And of course, I can't remember the author's name, but that was an important one for me. Out of the 10 young, cancer comrades I met during treatment, only 3 of us are still alive. And there was a way in which I couldn't process those losses while they were happening. And now I've had to kind of attend to them. So that book was really helpful.
I did once hear a writer say, no recovery, only integration, which I think is really true. These losses are part of who we are. Sara, I'm going to have to close pretty soon, but I wondered if there are scientists that we should read for comfort, for solace. Can you recommend work that, that's a tough question to throw at you like this, but if there's somebody that you think we should be paying attention to, I'd love to know.
I think it's really trial and error, and how much technical detail you want to get into. I think you could, so my book, it wasn't the first of its kind, but there's kind of a genre out there now, and it's women scientists writing memoirs that intertwine their professional life with their personal life. Most of them don't have trauma, like at the level that my book does, but that's one people might like to get into, actually. It shows what scientists do, and normal, different, all wrapped together in learning something new as well.
I love the potential for metaphor there. All of you embrace the natural world in ways that are comforting to your reader. I'm grateful to you, all of you. Thank you for your beautiful books. I'm better for reading them. Thanks to Emily and Sara and Suleika for your excellent company on the page and on Zoom, in the Zoom. And thanks to everybody who's listened in to this conversation. Please do support your local booksellers, everybody. Remember, you can get that signed book plate if you go to Pages, a bookstore. These authors have signed plates for you to put into your books. And thanks to you all. Everybody stay safe and stay well. Okay.
Thank you, Dinah.
Thank you. I love it.
Sarah.
Bye, you guys.